A lot gets banned in competitive Pokemon. Most of it needs to be banned because it ruins the playing experience. It's not good for competition or fun if something ridiculous like, say, Mega Rayquaza is running around. However, not everything that gets banned is Mega Rayquaza or even base Rayquaza, whether through a strange set of circumstances breaking something, or possibly incompetence, or even both. Some Pokemon get banned that really aren't very good at all. So we're diving into the worst cases of this, and we split them up into several sections. Bad Pokemon with one broken tool that made them too much, Pokemon that were debatably not actually good enough to be ban-worthy, bad Pokemon that probably shouldn't have been, and the most egregious, bad Pokemon that were banned because of a technicality. And we're gonna start off with that 4-armed Gen 4 menace, Gen 4 Machamp. It's not even that good, cried the Gen 4 OU player base when it came time to potentially ban the Pokemon that they had universally complained about for the previous decade, in which Machamp had near single-handedly dismantled the metagame's previously glowing reputation through sheer force of RNG. A harrowing testament to the normalization of abuse, perhaps, when these long-standing victims of failed fighting resist were suddenly singing the praises of Machamp as essential in maintaining Gen 4's balance through its reliable stall breaking, which consisted of it breaking through physically defensive Hippowdon, a Pokemon that wasn't even guaranteed to 4-hit KO via confusion alone. Now, Stockholm Syndrome aside, there was some truth to the matter. Machamp was not a good Pokemon overall, and without No-Guard Dynamic Punch in its arsenal, it would have almost surely been banished to the realms of BL. There's a reason it was either used on paralysis spam teams or as a lead, because it seriously struggled to switch into battle safely. That might seem strange, as it's far from frail, it's got very good HP and decent enough defenses, but it's also incredibly slow, mono fighting isn't exactly rife with resist, and it was also vulnerable to every single form of passive damage, which meant in practice it was a lot more fragile than it might appear, and even little hits added up incredibly quickly. Thus, Machamp could only function as a lead, where it basically sacrificed itself to win a 1v1, or more commonly, and dangerously, as a paralysis abuser that preyed on slowed down teams with Dynamic Punch increasing the odds of their immobilization. Its power is such that it usually needed only one such turn to break through frailer targets, a problem exacerbated by it using all 3 free turns to throw up a substitute and thus further shield itself from its own bad bulk. Machamp was certainly strong, but only without the opponent so commonly being unable to move against it. And thus that's how the tier's plentiful fighting resist regularly lost to it, thanks to the odds that are no better and often worse than the coin flip. Without this, it wouldn't have been especially remarkable at all. So yes, Machamp wasn't even that good. It was a pretty bad Pokemon that became a broken monstrosity because of a busted tool in its arsenal. No different from how the utterly awful Dugtrio becomes peerlessly nightmarish through Arena Trap. With this line of thought, should this not have meant that it was Dynamic Punch that was banned instead of Machamp itself? Many players thought so, but it was only Machamp that was placed on the chopping block, and that's why it now sits in the Uber tier list between Lugia and Manaphy. Though there's no obligation for an Uber Pokemon to be good in Ubers, it's still striking to see a Pokemon so markedly worse than literally everything else. Well, besides Why Not, maybe. Now on that subject, next we have Why Not Gothorita, Diglett, and Trapinch. But before we go into the next Pokemon, once again, this video is sponsored by Raycon. School is back in session, and though I'm not in school anymore, I sure wish I had these Raycon Everyday Clip earbuds back then. If you're going back to school yourself or shopping for someone, consider picking these up, since they are super lightweight and comfortable, but the clip design makes it so that they don't fall out. I honestly don't know what I'd do without my Raycons. I'd probably just sit there staring at my chores list. It's great to be able to listen to my favorite podcasts or music while I'm doing chores or going for my morning walks. These clip earbuds are especially good since they won't get in the way of your glasses if you wear them. The clips themselves also have no pressure, so your ears won't be worn out over long periods of time. And as always with Raycon, the sound is very clear, the wireless range is quite big, as I don't even need my phone to be in the same room half the time while I'm using them, and they have 30 hours of battery life. You get a whole 8 hours while you use them, and 30 hours if you just keep them in the case. I honestly don't remember when I last charged them, since the battery lasts so long. The Everyday Clip earbuds are the perfect back-to-school companion. So if you want to pick them up, click the link in the description below, or go to buyraycon.com/FSGClip to get 20% off the Everyday Clip earbuds. Thank you to Raycon for sponsoring this video. Trapping abilities have made all sorts of bad Pokemon broken, like Wobbuffet, Gothitelle, the aforementioned Dugtrio. They're all completely worthless without their abilities. But what's really insane is that even their pre-evolutions are banned because of them. Now technically, these Pokemon aren't banned so much as their abilities are, but why is it that the abilities are banned as a whole, instead of these Pokemon's final stage evolutions that actually caused all the mayhem? Surely Arena Trap isn't broken when it's being used by Diglett, right? Well, to an extent this is true. Are they ultra broken? Not really, at least in the a traditional sense, but A, neither were their evolutions, and also B, yes, actually they were. Of course, having them banned was more to prevent players from trying to pull the same kind of cheese their fully evolved forms were banned for in the first place, as it'd be less successful than the Shed Shell, Infestation, Dugtrio, and Gothitelle turned multiple metagames into, but there was really no competitively minded reason to keep around their mini versions so that players could try and steal a win against more skilled opponents. Because if you thought you stood a real chance, you wouldn't bother. However, even beyond this being a precaution, there were actually several cases that proved even these tykes could still be disruptive. Like in Gen 6, when Gothitelle left Stallbreakers unable to escape from the Choice Scarf and trick them, and thus rendered them unable to break the otherwise brutally resilient stall team that it was placed on, it was put up for a ban, but it had to extend to Shadow Tag as a whole. Because guess what? Even before Gothitelle had left the tier, players were using Gothorita to do the exact same thing, and it pretty much did it just as well, thus proving you really had to get rid of Shadow Tag fully, much in the Wobbuffet and Wynot vein. But all the Goth family had to do was trick a Choice Scarf. Pretty much anything could do that. Magikarp could pull it off with access to Shadow Tag and Trick. What about the Arita Trap Pokemon that A, didn't trap literally everything the way Shadow Tag did, and B, were actually required to do damage to accomplish their task? Well, in Gen 7, when Dugtrio first really came on the radar thanks to the boost to its base attack, some players tested Diglett to see if it would have the same effect, and it pretty much did. Obviously, it didn't hit every target of Dugtrio's with the same lethal efficiency, but being able to prevent opponents from switching out leads to all sorts of customizability in, if not directly taking the target out, then ruining it to the point of rendering it no longer a problem, even if it's just, say, landing a Toxic on top of Bulu that cannot afford to get Toxic if it wants to do its job. This is essentially the same sort of neutralization of the Goth family's Trick Scarf shenanigans. This resulted in Arena Trap's ban as a whole in Gen 7, which would be followed by every other generation besides the third, eventually. Somehow, when the Dugtrio train came to Gen 5 and the player base wanted to ban Arena Trap as a whole, a bunch of folks who didn't play the meta yet loved debating the tiniest nitpicks of tiering policy suggested only Dugtrio should be banned, since no way Diglett could be, right? They had enough sway to make this the reality for several months, a meantime which consisted of Diglett doing pretty much the same thing as Dugtrio, which was forcibly removing Tyranitar and Heatran, and thus destabilizing the entire meta that relied on them against Sun teams. Obviously, Diglett didn't do this quite as effortlessly, and didn't come with the side benefit of picking off other threats like Terrakion, but in effect the result was the same where it mattered, and that is what it took to get Arena Trap canned as a whole, Trapinch and all, which even with its sub-everything base 10 speed, was also found to be able to cause pointless headaches. Finally, we can briefly consult this replay, which consists of 4 Shadow Taggers, 2 of them not fully evolved, to see the kind of nonsense not banning these abilities wholesale does, even if it results in Babymons getting banned. Now we move on to a different sort of case, or cases, with Gen 3 Cacturne and Gen 4 Frostlass. Gen 3 Cacturne wasn't exactly a bad Pokemon. Flawed, sure. It wasn't fast or bulky, yet while this was usually a death knell for viability, Cacturne still had a lot to like. It was immune to Celebi's Leech Seed and Stab Psychic, while dishing out not just its own Leech Seeds, but Spikes as well, and would get plenty of opportunity against more than just Celebi, with resist to Surf, Thunderbolt, and Earthquake. Plus, while its move's lower base power meant Cacturne wouldn't be bowling over the tier, it still had excellent offenses and valuable coverage between its stabs that meant it could deal some solid direct damage as well. The problem was that Cacturne also had Sand Veil, which meant it went from a nice little niche Pokemon to a metagame shredding monster that had to be banned. Well, not Cacturne directly. Thanks to some assists from Gligar, it was Sand Veil as a whole that was broken. But seeing as Cacturne, unlike Gligar, didn't have another ability to use instead, it effectively wound up as Uber as Kyogre or Mewtwo, despite being, well, Cacturne. Was it really that broken, some players wondered? Well, once the player base realized the extent of its insane potential, yes, definitely. With high impact moves like Spikes and Leech Seed, as well as its deceptively adept offense, you do not want to be giving Cacturne free turns, as many discovered upon finding it quickly running through their teams as a result of dodging as little as a single hidden power bug off the sole battle condition of the Sandstorm that is already ever present in advance from one's own Tyranitar as well, in most cases the opponent's. Funnily enough, in cases of accuracy related tiering controversies, a common response from inexperienced players is just to run Aerial Ace, as if that's going to help you against a Garchomp, but in Cacturne's case, it did actually apply, as Gen 3 was the rare meta where Aerial Ace was an actually common move, as the meta-defining Dugtrio already came equipped with it to eliminate Heracross, and later on Breloom. But one counter does not disprove a broken element's brokenness, especially when it's a menace abusing RNG the way Cacturne did so effortlessly and to such devastating effect. Plus, even with Cacturne's non-existent physical bulk, Dugtrio's Aerial Ace still couldn't one-shot it, even if it ran an adamant nature, which it usually didn't. Cacturne disrupted advance far too much through the power of RNG, and as with other RNG-related transgressors, the numbers were actually on its side, with it usually needing just one miss against moves that were 80% accurate at best. You wouldn't want to hit multiple Hydro Pumps or Stone Edges in a row, and yet against a substitute spamming Cacturn, that was your best case scenario. One miss and it would Leech Seed up and be able to get more subs, especially with the switches it then caused, and it'd be a whole mess. It might not sweep you on the spot, but it certainly leave you easy pickings for its teammates, when the numbers are so much on something else's side that you can just go for the RNG option against just about everything. There's generally a problem, and that's why Cacturn was gone, though some players even now still pine for its non-broken qualities. A Spiker with Leech Seed and its typing really would have been nice to have. While Cacturn was genuinely solid, it had a counterpart in Gen 4 Frostlass that was less so. Also a Spiker with unique traits, in Frostlass's case, Ghost typing giving it a built-in spin blocking effect, as well as the fastest spikes outside of Ubers. That also meant its taunt was speedy as well. This was enough to give it a small niche as a lead in OU. However, it was banned twice, despite being pretty much the least broken thing anyone could imagine. The first time it was when Sandveil was banned, and the aforementioned rule sticklers who loved interfering in metas they didn't play insisted that if Sandveil was banned, Snowcloak absolutely had to be banned as well, because they were obviously completely the same, and they would be persuaded by no amount of arguing that Sandveil was used on better Pokemon overall in a metagame dominated by not one but two Sand Setters, sometimes used on the same team, and Snowcloak required using a fringe Pokemon just to set the hail, to say nothing of the difficulties maintaining the hail in the face of said Sand Setters, and building an even halfway effective team with two Ice types, and the fact that nobody had ever caused any sort of havoc with Snowcloak dodges in Gen 4 OU ever. So Frostlass, without an alternate ability to use, was banned, despite doing absolutely nothing to warrant it. Eventually, it came back after a clause was instated that just banned Snowcloak on Pokemon that had alternate abilities they could use, like Mamoswine, but after several years of Frostlass barely being used at all in its intended guise as a Spikes lead, let alone as a Snowcloak abuser, in a series of satire-defying events, a player decided to prove Frostlass's brokenness by making a Hail team with it, getting a few low-ladder replays of it winning, and getting Snowcloak banned before it could do any real damage, and thus a Pokemon that wasn't even good with the supposed broken element got itself canned again. Alright, now for the next part, we have Pokemon that were good even without some sort of gimmick, but not that good as to warrant a ban. And with that, we have Gen 6 Hoopa U and Mega Sableye. There is little doubting Hoopa Unbound's destructive bonafides. It received a ton of hype upon being unleashed later in ORAS, hitting hard even by power creep standards, doing so with a great variety in its move pool, a speed stat just decent enough, and even great natural special bulk. However, it was quickly deemed far from overwhelming, until its choice spec set reared its head and unleashed some impressive one-hit KOs. You definitely do a double take when you see some of the KOs its psychic grabs against things like Clefable, while it's hard to resist Dark Pulse, cleaves through much of the tier, and Focus Blast keeps Tyranitar and Weavile out while shattering even the most specially defensive Heatran and Ferrothorn, and not long after doing so, it was banned, cited as making defensive teams over-rely on Pursuit to keep it in check. This would come to be viewed in retrospect as hasty for a number of reasons. Put simply, it was a knee-jerk reaction to so quickly suspect and ban a Pokemon that hadn't been a problem beforehand, and even at its most optimized, was not particularly different from other strong yet flawed wall breakers like Kyurem Black. Hoopa Unbound wasn't fast, it was incredibly frail physically, while packing a quadruple weakness to U-turn to boot, and bulky teams already tended to rely on Pursuit to keep a number of big Pokemon in check, so it was hardly some sort of added strain placed on them specifically by Hoopa Unbound. Of course, it had the potential to be dangerous, but not especially uniquely so, especially demonstrated by its performance in the next generation, though two different generations generally shouldn't be compared, or as the Sun and Moon similarities got some people thinking that maybe Hoopa Unbound really wasn't that much of a problem, and maybe it should be brought back. It was difficult for anyone to make a real argument that it would be more broken than several Pokemon that were still in the tier, like Volcarona and Mega Metagross, but the enthusiasm to get it unbanned just wasn't there. Regardless, Hoopa Unbound was by far one of the least broken Pokemon to get the ban hammer in ORAS, another case of not being broken even at its best. And in this sense, it was similar to another controversial Gen 6 ban, Mega Sableye, though that had some major differences. It was a worse Pokemon overall. It could hardly be a wall with such low speed and HP, undercutting its strong but not insane defenses, but the potential of its magic bounce ability definitely had a more adverse effect on the metagame overall, completely stifling the vast majority of the indirect tactics that had previously worked hand in hand with Brute Force to dismantle Stall. When teams were only able to use Brute Force as a tactic, as much as they might be able to muster some impressive numbers, it generally wasn't enough to break through a well-built defensive squad. It seemed ridiculous. Hoopa as a wall breaker was at least threatening, whereas Mega Sableye was decidedly not, at least not in the traditional sense, but was far more limiting, while potentially doing nothing far more often as well. It was basically, you really want to use your Mega slot on this when you've got Metagross running around, among others? But the answer turned out to be yes, and then some. Turns out when you can't get up hazards reliably, or taunt or leech seed or status, then all the power in the metagame isn't going to help you. Mega Sableye ban was also retroactively controversial thanks to being banned at least partially because of partnership with Dugtrio. After Mega Sableye's ban, Dugtrio had continued to wreak havoc and was banned itself, leading to the expansion of sentiment around Mega Sableye not being broken, which had already existed but now seemed even more reasonable without Dugtrio potentially exacerbating it. Some had already identified Dugtrio as being the problematic element before, just another extension of the trapping issues that had first reared their heads with stall teams using Mega Sableye alongside Gothitelle. However, it was ultimately decided that what Mega Sableye did was too fundamentally uncompetitive to bring back. The talk around retrying it often coincided with the desire for an answer to the dangerous Mega Metachamp, but beyond that, nobody really had anything positive to say about Mega Sableye either. Despite falling far more flat than other Megas, it also did warp the metagame to obnoxious degrees with how restrictive it could be. Regardless of what side you fall on, Mega Sableye really can't be considered too good a Pokemon. And now we're gonna go the opposite route, but quickly dive into Ubers, with of course Reshiram and Solgaleo. Reshiram and Solgaleo didn't get banned so much as they were always banned, like every other big Uber dating all the way back to Mewtwo. Ever since the box art legend became a concept, with Ho-Oh and Lugia being on the covers of Gold and Silver, these as well as other legendaries with huge stats were automatic inclusions to Ubers at the beginning of Ubers. Because why wouldn't they be? Is there really any question that Dialga would be too much for standard play? It wasn't until Black and White 2 where this was disrupted for the first time, with Kyurem Black dropping the OU and staying there for the next several generations until it actually got a physical move pool in Gen 8. It was followed in Gen 9 with Zamazenta, admittedly having been nerfed from its Gen 8 form, that also dropped to OU. Even before Zamazenta became the second box art Pokemon you could use in the same metagame as other standard staples like Landorus, there were many conversations about which others deserved to get the Kyurem Black treatment, and indeed even a pre-nerf Zamazenta was heavily discussed to be dropped in Gen 8, but none were more devastating of at least being given a shot than these two famous Uber non-factors, Reshiram and Solgaleo. Being bad in Ubers isn't necessarily a requirement for this, as nobody's clamoring to drop Deoxys normal, but these two were just so crappy they didn't even seem like they'd be able to do all that much in standard. Now that's a slight exaggeration, but it would be nearly impossible for anyone to make a legitimate argument for either of them as among even the top several Pokemon in the metagame, let alone broken. The Hazard Ravaged Reshiram would find the majority of its awe-inspiring Dragon Fire power wasted, for example, via its middling speed and exploitable weaknesses amidst a Gen 5 metagame packing no less than 4 Dragon types that would be better overall. Its coverage would be unique, but again, it wouldn't really be doing anything different from a Kyurem Black style wall breaker that KO'd something before getting revenge killed itself, in a format with no shortage of extreme power, while being slower than Kyurem Black itself. Meanwhile, Solgaleo's typing is far more defensively robust and its defenses are impressive, but its move pool offers very little in the way of concrete utility for Gen 7 OU, at least in any way that could possibly be considered broken. Sure, it'd be a cooler Choice Scarfer, it'd probably have a neat defensive utility set with knockoff, but broken? There's a double-digit number of Pokemon in Gen 7 OU that would be considered broken before Solgaleo would. Reshiram and Solgaleo make you think about the purpose of the OU tier if these kinds of Pokemon exist. Not only can you not argue they'd be broken, you could hardly even argue they'd be among the best Pokemon in the metagame, but they started off in Ubers, and there they will remain in perpetuity. Many questions arise, such as, should Ubers be the standard singles metagame? Who's to say? And speaking of Solgaleo, we now dip over to VGC, that has by far the worst banned Pokemon because mythical Pokemon and Cosmog and Cosmoem are banned by technicality. There's so many Pokemon that would not only be not broken, but in most cases not very good, or in the cases of Cosmog and Cosmoem, literally Magikarp level unviable, right down to the few moves they learn including Splash, except Magikarp can at least learn damaging moves. However, they are not allowed in most VGC rule sets besides the restricted formats. With Cosmog and Cosmoem, it's because they evolve into Solgaleo and Lunala, which are restricted Pokemon. So strange, but okay, it's not like anyone's missing out on anything there. But as for Mythicals, it's purely for fairness and practicality purposes. The nature of their event-based distribution limits who is able to access them in-game based on their location, meaning certain players would be at a disadvantage simply because they couldn't access some of the same Pokemon as everyone else without resorting to cheating. This is especially relevant because several of the mythical Pokemons would be among the top Pokemon, even if they might only appear in restricted formats, and going up against an opponent with Arceus without your own simply based on where you live would be too unfair. Could this not be solved with better, more universal ways of obtaining these Pokemon? Pokemon, one might ask? Certainly, one might answer. Though nobody ever accused Game Freak of making things easy or reasonable. One might acknowledge that at least they're trying to make things fair now, though that's something. Anyways, Mythicals not being allowed resulted in the unintended impacts of Darkrai's would-be VGC performance actually coming from Smeargle, which spammed the Double Sleep Dark Void to brutal effect in the 2016 season. This then resulted in Darkrai's signature Dark Void getting nerfed into Oblivion, and needlessly at that, seeing as part of the nerf included making it fail if not used by Darkrai, making the other part where it became 50% accurate, i.e. less reliable than Hypnosis, so completely pointless. And this is especially sad because there was one format in Gen 9 where Mythicals were allowed in VGC, and yeah, Arceus was the most used mythical, but more importantly, Darkrai never got to use its more accurate Dark Void from previous generations once it was finally actually allowed. Nobody ever accused Game Freak of competence, much less perfection, except perhaps for our final case with, of course, Bidoof and Bibarel. The Golden Bidoof. Well, that was from the Adventures of Pokemon Trainer Rusty and not Game Freak itself, but Game Freak set it up, so we'll give it to them. Anyway, as if to prove Moody to be amongst the most absurd abilities ever, it was given to one of the most famously awful Pokemon ever and its pre-evolution, and that resulted in them, yes, Bidoof included, sweeping teams and Ubers. Turns out when you substitute Protect Stall for massive boosts every turn, even Arceus and friends aren't safe, especially when those boosts include evasion and they can't actually hit it. This is to say nothing of the, shall we say, more generally competent Pokemon that also have Moody. Things like Octillery and Glalie are far from ever being considered good, but they're certainly not Bibarel, meaning with Moody, they become even more outrageous. But while it's strange, it's basically on par with something like Gen 3 Cacturn being banned, or Glalie cousin Frostlass. It's certainly not as bizarre as the ability breaking a Pokemon whose greatest function was to learn a lot of HM moves so you could beat the game in Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum before moving on to the competitive scene, and that Pokemon's pre-evolution. Bidoof going from a Gen 4 joke to literally taking down Arceus in Gen 5, well, Bidoof beating Arceus literally was a Gen 4 joke. Maybe Game Freak's more calculating than we thought. And thank you so much to our Platinum patrons. Thank you to Alex Sable, Anthony Belval Renault, Daniel Isbeast, Corman, Don Krieg, Eric Dissing, Espion Lover, Funky, Glitcherton, Howl, Jack G, King Yabber, Nightfall, Megamon VGC, Mojo Game Slayer, Nurse Jake, One Penguin to Rule, Ozar Pariah, Pretzel SP, Palamute, Plutonian Shores, Primal Legends, Ribbit Rover, Schmooter, Seagulls Incorporated, Sojiro Sakura, Spavoon, Gylaria, Soras and Croxton, Shiwei Miji, Stoneface Colin, Tyler, Kiboflu, Wardine, Zachary Stimson for their major support of our videos.